Welcome back to another episode of the Startup Therapy Podcast. This is Ryan Rutan, joined as always by Will Schroeder, my friend, the founder of startups.com. Will, hypothetically speaking, for everybody listening, this is hypothetical. We run out of money and nobody wants to give us any more. What do we do?
Run for the hills. We are in the no man's land of funding.
Yay.
Time to
Sounds
go.
like a great place to be.
Well, no one ever told me I was there. That's the worst part, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I thought like we'd raised a bunch of money. This is for multiple startups. We'd raised a bunch of money. And I thought at that moment that, we're just going to get more money. But you go out to the market and then like anything else in life, at some point you start to look around and realize it ain't happening.
Right.
The difference is, we've talked about this like in long ago in another podcast, was no one tells you, right? You're waiting for that moment where somebody comes in and they're like, okay, you pull you out of the game, coach says got to sub you out kind of thing.
Right.
And it doesn't happen. And you're just left there, like, again, in no man's land. And it sucks. And I think we should talk about, there's a lot of people that either are in that spot right now, or think they might be, and probably will be. It sucks, but it happens. And what do you actually do about it, right? And so let's walk through it. Let's talk about kind of what your options are and what people tend to do and what's realistic. All right. So before we get into this next topic, I just want to let you know what we talk about here is like 1% of the conversation. Really, this conversation is going on all day long online at groups.startups.com, where Ryan and I pretty much talk endlessly with founders about every one of these topics. So if by the end of this discussion, you like the topic and you want to dig into it a little bit more with Ryan and I, just head to groups.startups.com and we'll pick it up from there.
So can we start by talking like what are the early signs here? What's the canary in the coal mine at this point? I mean, obviously running out of money all the way is one of them, but is there anything else that gives us the sort of heads up that, hey, this situation's about to occur? We're sort of in that spot, given that nobody's going to tell us.
One people don't expect.
Yeah.
It's when you ask your investors, your existing investors, how much they're going to put in the next round, and they don't give you a straight answer, or they say no.
Or no.
Right?
Yeah.
Because just to be clear, the whole point of investing is that when things are going well and or you believe in the company, you want to put more money in because the stock is going up. You want more of it, right? That's the whole point of this thing.
Yes.
Conversely, if you're not putting money into it, and look, there's sometimes other reasons. Sometimes maybe the next round is bigger than what you invested, it's outside of your preferences, or maybe you don't have more cash, who knows? But generally speaking, when you're sitting in the boardroom and you're asking everybody, hey, how's this next round look? And everyone's just looking at each other and they don't have like a real answer. What's that saying that if you don't know who the sucker is at the table, it's you?
It's you. Yes, exactly.
That would apply in this very case.
Is it safe to say that this is typically an issue for funded companies, right? That we're, and it's your companies that were already intending to go on and raise a second round. So this is that gap between funding rounds that then there isn't really a gap because there's no second funding round. This isn't a problem that exists if we're not actively trying to go from like Series A to Series B to Series C.
Right. The thing is, once you raise money, you just constantly raise money. That's the whole point of this game. Folks that haven't done it before think that, I just raised a round and that's sort of just it. Right. And then I guess we make a ton of money and we never need more money. And that sounds awesome. But kind of the general saying is if you raise money the first time, you only have two outcomes. Either things go really shitty and you have to go raise more money, or things go really well and you have to go raise money because you need more money to keep that party going.
Yeah.
And either way, you're there. But what winds up happening invariably is we all hit a point where we're ready to raise the next round. Run around and we start talking to investors and talking to our own investors and trying to get people fired up. But nobody seems like that fired up, right? You can tell, like, you went on a date and you're not quite getting that call back. You're sitting there waiting for the phone to ring.
Yep.
And everybody kind of feels it, but nobody talks about it. And that's the worst part. So as a founder, here's where your head is at. Right now, you're thinking, well, I'm just waiting for a few investors to call me back. That's really, that's all this is. And yeah, some of the existing investors, probably just not good timing for them, but that probably
Right.
happens all the time, right? And you don't realize you're in no man's land. And you also don't realize that there are only three options to get out of it. And we'll talk about what those options are in detail, but that's it. And
Yeah.
there's nothing else you can do. And the whole point is you have to quickly and decisively exercise one of the options. And there's no other question. So let's get into the options.
Sure.
So option number one, and I like this one because it's a bit of a curveball. It's what a lot of people don't think of, but I love it when founders talk about it. It's to buy it back.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Because Ryan, I'm trying to think. Do you remember we talked about this in another episode where we said there's this interesting spot where all this money goes into a company,
Yeah.
right? All this venture funding, et cetera, all this investment to build this great asset with the intention that it's going to be this big venture fundable thing.
Right.
But then it doesn't become that outcome, right? It doesn't become like $100 billion business. And so we can't raise more money because that outcome just doesn't exist. Proved the total addressable market wasn't big, but still a pretty cool asset. And every founder thinks the same thing. They think, boy, Ryan, if you and I had just not raised money and we had this same asset, this would be a badass business.
Yeah.
So the ninja move here, buy it back.
Yep. Right. Because you're not allowed to have that business as a venture funded company, right? Because then it's a lifestyle business and it falls into that particular purgatory if you're venture funded. So at that point, buying it back is sort of the only option you have in the scenario that you just laid out. Because that's an entirely different type of no man's land, right? Well, not really, I guess, because it sort of puts you in that same spot, right? You've figured out there's a good reason not to go get more money. That's actually something I think we should spend a minute or two on, which is why is that other funding round not coming through, right? Sometimes there's really good reasons for that. The example that you gave was that the TAM just proved to not be big enough for this thing to be able to scale and drive venture type returns. Also doesn't mean that it can't be a good business, but it can't get more capital to try to become the business that you originally thought it could be. And so this leaves you, happens all the time. And unfortunately, it often leads to death instead of just some sort of a restructuring, which is, I think, what we're talking about now. But what are the other reasons that other bookend just doesn't exist, right? So why can we not get these other funding rounds? So, are there times, and I can think of a few cases where there were legitimately businesses that I felt like had a good case for additional funding, and just didn't manage to pull it together, or didn't manage to pull it together in time, and ended up in the same situation. But what else occurs there? Like, why do we end up in this position?
I can think of two different examples of venture funded businesses, friends of mine. One team had a $2 million business. The other team had a $5 million business. Mm-hmm. But the problem was, for what they were trying to accomplish at the venture funding and funding scale, the $2 million business the next year was going to do 2.1, the next year 2.3, the next year 2.5, right?
Yep.
The moment you do back-to-back, 10% year-over-year growth rounds, you're not telling a venture story anymore.
Correct.
Right? It's like anything else in this world. The moment people know the ending, you can't craft a new one. And that's a very specific problem. And then the other team, they built a $5 million business, and $5 million is a fair amount of cash. You know what I mean? In their formative stages, and early on, like year 1, 2, 3, that starts to look really good. You're like, oh damn, we're at 5 million already. Then that's 50 million in a couple of years, until it's not.
Right.
But a $5 million business, and both of these wound up being buybacks. A $5 million business is a big enough business that, like, you probably don't want to let it go.
Right.
The $2 million business, tough nut to swallow, but you could wind it down. 5 million is a real company at that point.
Yes.
Right? It's not the biggest company in the world, but very few companies make it to that size, regardless of what startup lore might tell you. And it's a lot harder to say, I'm walking away from it.
Sure.
But here's what I'll say, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. What folks don't realize is that when we get to the point of this no man's land of funding, we're in a tough spot, but the investors are totally fucked, right? Because they can't run the company. They're not going to buy it back and run it. Like, that's not what they do.
They can't.
So,
they don't have that option.
Right. What we don't understand as the founders is we're also the operators.
Yep.
And if we leave, then it's game over.
Yes.
Right. Like it's at that point,
Curtains. Yep.
right. It's curtains. So we actually control the final outcome, although it doesn't really feel that way at the time.
Exactly. Well, so let's circle back and let's talk about how do we actually do this? Because I think that when we have these conversations with founders, invariably they're like, "Look, I don't have any money. That's why I
Right.
needed more investment. What the hell are you telling me to do? Buy it back with what? How am I actually going to execute this?" And so let's walk through the mechanics of that, because I think there are a lot of people listening who are going to be surprised at how possible and plausible this actually is, and it's not obvious. Right. So let's walk people through it.
Step one for all of these, all the options we're going to talk about today, is to admit we're fucked.
Yes.
Right. Because what's going to happen is we're going to be like, listen, I don't think we're in a very good shape or any good spot. And the investors are going to be like, no, we're good. You know what I mean? Like we're going to find that one buyer, that one other investor, et cetera. And it's like, bro, that's easy for you to say.
Right.
Right. But I'm the one who actually has to drag this thing through the mud. And
Yes.
I'm not willing to do it anymore.
Yeah.
Founders, PSA, once again, you don't have to drag yourself through the mud. Yes, you have to get beat up a little to make sure that this is the outcome. But there's a point, it's way sooner than you think it is, when it's time to be like, okay, enough is enough. I got to go fish or cut bait here. So what the buyback looks like, buyback starts with, hey, it's game over, right? So chapter is closed.
Yep.
I'm leaving unless these circumstances prevail. And those circumstances look something like this. I'm leaving unless we recap the company, which essentially means we take all the equity back and we redistribute it.
Yes.
We redistribute it to the people that are going to stick around to see this thing through. You're basically taking the equity back. Now, the investors don't have to agree, but plan B is you shut it all down.
Right.
So plan A is you get nothing. Or I'm sorry, plan A is you give up something. Plan B is you shut it all down.
Yep.
And by way of that, that's the leverage that founders don't understand they have. And I've seen so many founders go through this successfully, painfully, because no one wants to hear that they're going to get recapped. But you can go back to the investors and come up with a new deal, a fresh deal that says, here are the conditions that I would stick around and run this company on a go-forward basis. It's not the outcome you wanted, but it's the only outcome we have left. And if it's a $5 million company, there's money to pay people, right? There's a real business there.
Yep.
And yeah, it's not a big venture funded business, but Ryan, if you and I own it, might be an incredible business for us. Maybe we make that a $10, $20 million business and we retire with amazing lives.
By the way, I just want to mention, if what we're talking about today sounds like the kind of discussion you wish you were having more often, you actually can. We're online all day, every day, working through exactly these types of topics with founders just like you. So any question you would have, or maybe some problem you just want to work through, we're here and we love this stuff. And we're easy to find. Head over to groups.startups.com and let's just start talking.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So the mechanics of this, again, not obvious, but also not difficult. And to your point, I think most founders don't realize they have any leverage in the situation because they feel completely levered up until that point, right? I have to do these things. I have to make it work. I have to make this thing grow. It's not working. I've failed. So therefore, I have no leverage. Well, you don't if you continue on that path.
That mentality.
That path now being dead. You get to turn around and go the other direction, which is to say that now we're not going to try to scale this thing to that extent. We're not going to try to grow this thing under the constructs of venture capital, and we're just going to build a reasonable business or a great business for the ownership, and it leaves the investors out in the cold, which not awesome, right? And it's not like you intentionally
none of
did
this.
This.
Is awesome.
It wasn't. None of it's awesome.
Yeah.
Right, but it's far more awesome for the remaining staff, for the founders, and of course there are things that you can do. We've certainly seen scenarios whereby you don't completely push the investors out of the cap table, but you put them into a more appropriate seat. You work out profit sharing deals. I've seen people convert portions of it over to debt payable on certain revenue milestones. Lots of things you can do to be creative here so that it doesn't feel like you're just taking your toys and going to play in your own sandbox after they've helped to get it to that point, right? Which is not to be forgotten.
But it's always worth asking.
Yes,
but I think it
100%.
opens up with, right? Look, If you want to pursue this, that's cool. I'm okay if we don't do it, but I got nothing left, right?
Yep.
Otherwise, I'm going to go get another job.
Yeah.
Right? And so
One that pays me money.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. And whenever I talk to founders like this, I was talking to another founder last summer, and they were in a spot where the company was doing 30 million in revenue, right? So a significant amount of revenue.
Yeah.
But same thing, expenses stripped revenue, and the company
Sure.
was losing money, couldn't get to a funding round, and they had to do something with it. Once again, say, look, man, $30 million is a lot of cash, right? That's way too much money to not be able to restructure in some way and,
Right.
and build and reconstitute a business. Probably not under a broken cap table. In some cases, probably not with you making $90,000 a year, because that's what you've been stuck making for the last 7 years or whatever your timeline was.
Yep.
And you restart it, and you look at it as as a buyback. And investors will always push back at first, no different than you would.
Yep.
But they'll also come to the realization that at some point there's no other option.
Yeah. They're beating a dead horse at that point.
Which brings us to the next point. Assuming that doesn't work, assuming maybe you don't want to do it, maybe the company makes no money, right? The next is we gotta fire sale it. And now, here's where this line of thinking breaks. When I say, look, you're in a fire sale situation, no, we're not. We're not in a fire sale situation. We're in a sales situation, right? We've got assets. People want to buy this thing. Try selling a startup company that is out of money, has weeks or months to live, and see how much leverage you have in the sales process. Right? Good luck with that.
Yes.
You're the only person that doesn't realize you're in a fire sale situation. And we know, because we've talked to ungodly numbers of companies. I'll give you an example, Ryan, that you and I lived through. We've done diligence. We've sat down with over 100 startup companies to acquire. We've done diligence on 40, and most of them were in a fire sale situation without realizing it.
Yeah.
And the situation was in as much as, look, if this thing was taking off, like, going up and to the right, and you're raising tons of money, we wouldn't even be able to have a conversation with you, right? You'd be beyond what we could afford.
Exactly.
Right? But when a company hits a certain threshold where it's built a great product, it's had a lot of investment in it, but it's not necessarily a billion-dollar company. Well, that's tons of value to us, right? Even if it's not a billion-dollar company elsewhere. But that doesn't mean it's a leveraged situation where you can say, hey, we're just going to run a process and see how many people come knocking. Here's what happens. The investors, and by way of that, the founders, get this bizarre mindset where everybody sits around and agrees that the assets are really valuable. More importantly, there's a bunch of people, maybe a dumb buyer, right? That's going to see that, oh, you know what? Yeah, we never made a penny in this business, but the data. There's people who are going to want to buy that. That's the dumbest argument ever, right? Or
the one I love is
buy the IP or.
I love the one. It just needs a good operator. It just needs an operator, right? I love that one, right? As if the people who've been working on this thing for 5-6 years just suddenly haven't figured out how to operate, right? That's all it was. It just needs somebody who's an operations person. They're going to come in. Everything will be fine. As if this is a normal PE buyout. As if this thing isn't on its way to the bottom of the sea in weeks or months, right? So, lots of funny excuses at that point.
The problem isn't so much how you got there. That ship is sailed. The problem is how people internally perceive what the asset actually is, right? And what the outcome is. And so I had a couple situations where I'd built startups, we'd got a little bit of funding, and we got to no man's land. And I'm running around trying to see if there's going to be a buyer for it, right? And we had some people kind of kick the tires and maybe dig in a little bit, but not a ton. But the investors kept saying, like, this thing has so much value. Again, I kept hearing the data, or in the hands of the right person, this will be a huge buy.
Back to the operator thing. And
I'm like, a couple things. Number one, we have no money, so who's going to be standing around here to sell it, right? By the way, usually the founder, because we're dumb. We assume that we have to be chivalrous and run ourselves into the ground for 6 to 9 months and make ourselves bankrupt trying to fix this problem that nobody else wants to fix. Here's a good way to say it. If the investors are so sure that this thing is saleable, cool. Put in $100,000 of your money as a retainer to pay me through the sale. Guess how many people are going to sign up for that? Exactly zero. Right. It's a great deal when you fund it, Mr. Founder. It's not a great deal if you ask me to fund it. But Right. And so the other side of this, though, is uh, once we realize we're in fire sale situation, we have to understand that we don't have leverage here, right? This is more of whoever wants to buy it on almost any terms. And I love to negotiate. So I'm not the kind of person that says, hey, let's just, drop to our knees and get it over with. What
Right.
I'm trying to say is you've got to understand that at which point you have to sell the company, you're not in a position where you're getting top dollar. You're probably in a
That's right.
position where you're getting no dollar.
Yeah.
Right? You
Yeah.
take what you can get. It's a very different place.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I guess the core differentiator here, right? Because as we move from like phase 1 to phase 2, how much time are we typically talking about here? Like I'm trying to go back
Months.
through the history of,
Months.
yeah, it's measured in months. And so are there circumstances under which this doesn't move sequentially? I'm just thinking about, the buy it back, if that's not possible, do we ever skip the fire sale phase? Like under what conditions does that happen? Here's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I was not sure why this popped in my mind, but I'm thinking like you don't try to land an airplane with your hand on the eject handle, right? Like those two
Yeah, I
things
see
are
what you're saying.
incongruent, right? You can't, like, there's a point at which it's like, when should we really just cut bait? Because that's where we're going next, right? The next part of this whole thing is just run for the hills, right?
Right.
And so the timing of that is really important. You and I both know scores of humans who have ridden their startup further down than they should have and lost even more money. You're not just losing opportunity at that point, right? You're not just losing,
Right.
well, okay, if I keep doing, that's always the thing, right? It's like, okay, if I keep riding this out, I'll pull more money out of savings. I'll keep paying salaries. I'll do whatever.
Right.
I'll hire an
Go all
iBanker
in.
to, right? I'll do whatever I have to try to get rid of this thing. I'll go all in, right? I'm putting all my chips on the table, which often leaves you at the end with a table. And
Less than a table.
right? Just not awesome. And so I think that it's important to talk through that. Like, what are these triggers that would tell us like this is highly unlikely, right? Like I know we'd have to go through, like we'd essentially have to be doing diligence on theoretical businesses to do this, but are there any big signs that say, look, you're not going to be able to buy this back. You're also not going to be able to fire sale this thing. Let's accelerate the running for the hills piece.
Here, I hate to say this. Running for the hills is like your 80% option, right?
Right, that's the
Instead
thing.
of talking about this sequentially, let's look at it like a pie chart,
Yes.
right? And you were to look at my opportunity here and you say, I've
Yep.
got a 5% chance of a buyback. It's a long shot unless you've got a good enough size business that it's even worth kind of going through that process. I've got a 15% chance of selling it. And that doesn't mean I have a good chance. It just means the 80% chances I'm going to have to run for the hills.
Right.
So what I would do, Ryan, what you and I would do as co-founders of any business, of this hypothetical, Titanic business, is we'd sit down and if we were smart enough, we would say, look, chances are plane's going down,
Yep.
right? Tune up your resume, dude. We're gonna have some of these conversations, but we should be actively interviewing, right? It's
right.
time to go. By way of that, we should be actively cutting everything we can that's tied back to us. I'm talking about those expenses that we mistakenly put on our Amex or, whatever it is that we were tied to. I think run for the hills or plan to run for the hills and eject should be the primary plan. Now, some people are going to look at that and say, you son of a bitch, right? Right? All these investors put money into you. And what about all these founders that kind of got down to nothing and then turned it around and built it up? Bullshit.
All 4 of them. Yeah.
Right. Bullshit. Yes. There are some Rudy stories, right? Where somebody comes back and, and kind of wins the game, right? I wouldn't bet on the chance of those stories.
No.
And guess who's not betting on the chance of those stories? Your investors who are going to watch you run yourself off like Wile E. Coyote off the side of the cliff, right? We're not in this together, at which point the ship goes down, right? The investors have already invested a finite amount. They won't get it back, but they won't lose more.
Correct.
We will, right?
Yep.
You and I will, because we're going to put our time, our money, and all of our plans at the time when we have the least of those resources, right?
Yes.
An investor put in 50 grand, and they're going to lose it, and it sucks, right? But that money was already gone. They were either paying their bills, otherwise, or they won't. And if they couldn't, they shouldn't have written the $50,000 check, right?
Yep.
But we're not in that spot. We're totally leveraged. Our staff gone, right? they were updating their resume 6 months ago. Right?
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
under no illusions of what was happening. And,
Right.
and if we didn't think so,
There's
their
this thing
spouse
called a
definitely-
side hustle. It's
Yeah.
it's actually now a full-time job. You've become the side hustle because
they were gone.
the writing's on the wall. Yeah, but you bring up you brought up something interesting there, which is that they shouldn't have written that check if they didn't have the money. This gets pretty dicey if your first, maybe your only round, or at least there's significant amount of friends and family capital in a deal, right?
Yeah.
And not to pour gas on the fire here, but that definitely makes this a harder decision. And I think this is one of those things that incorrectly motivates founders to keep sticking to it. And to continue to just dig the hole deeper and deeper and deeper, because there's certainly a much higher emotional barrier there if this is a bunch of friends and family money versus the VC's money, right? It's all money, but at the end of the day, if these are people you're gonna have to sit down at Thanksgiving with, then that can feel pretty different than a VC who's made hundreds of bets this year.
I think we're talking about two different things, and I know I've been in the peril of this. We got two options. Again, you and I are co-founders in this theoretical company. And I say to you, Ryan, two options here. Option one is we can keep running ourselves into the ground, right? We feel compelled because of the relationships we have and the statements that we've made to do that. It's chivalrous.
We're also used to it at this point. Like it's what we've been doing. So there's to some degree, this is just inertia taking hold, right? We're just like, this is what I've been doing. I'll just keep doing it.
Right. Or option B is we can ask ourselves, we can look at the current state of things and say to ourselves, is this still a good bet for us? Right?
Yeah.
For the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, all our cash. Is this a bet we should be making? If we were decoupled from the situation and someone said, hey, will you invest time and money in this situation? Would we say yes? Of course we wouldn't.
Right.
We'd be like, this is a terrible idea, right? So why are we so compelled, knowing it's a terrible idea for us, to go do it anyway? Because the people around us, if they care about us, they don't want us to see us ruin ourselves. And if they don't care about them, care about the two of us, well, fuck them,
Yeah, right.
Let's go do something else.
Got an answer for them. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think it's one of those things. It's one of those causal factors that we see that ends up keeping people from just pulling that eject lever when they should have, right? And so there's lots of those, right? And there's the false hope that we can turn this around. There's the I've got to do this, for the team. There's sometimes we're so compelled by the problem we were trying to solve. If it's deeply personal, those things all can get in the way too. But like you said, the likelihood is, right, the writing was already on the wall. There's a reason you're having these discussions with yourself. The business was failing. It's likely to go under. And therefore, the sooner you let go of that, the better for everybody's sake, right? Not just for your own sake. But it's rarely executed that way, right? I mean, we often see founders putting on that ship captain's hat and putting on the brave face and going down with the ship. You know who remembers that later? Almost nobody except the founder. Right?
There's no
hey
hero
guys,
story.
remember that time when I was really cool and I was a superhero and I did the honorable thing? Like, you mean when you bought us lunch last week? What are you talking about, man?
Nobody remembers any of that. And at that point, within our lives, within our business, we wake up when we realize we're not playing to win. We're playing to not lose.
Yes.
And that is a very different place.
Yep.
And that goes back to the bad bet syndrome. Like we're putting, bad money on a bad bet, and no one's going to tell us otherwise. And I think at which point we get into this sort of no man's land of funding, we've got to realize that there's no money to be made here, right? There are no riches in this land. And the only thing we can do to save ourselves, to save the company and everyone around us is just to get out.
All right, so that was fun, but let's actually keep this conversation going. You've heard what we think about this, but Ryan and I would really like to hear what you think. And we're online like all day long, pretty much talking about every startup topic you could think of, from fundraising to customer acquisition to just really how to get all of this crazy startup stuff out of your head. And there's tons of other founders just like you. They're weighing in on these topics, so you'll get a chance to just hang out and meet some really smart founders. We're also super, super easy to find. You head over to groups.startups.com, and let Ryan and I hear what's on your mind. Let's get to know each other a little bit, and let's just start having more of these conversations.